An elderly father thought he was lucky when his son gifted him a trip to Florida, a reward for a lifetime of sacrifice. Smiles and words of praise from neighbors filled him with pride, his eyes welling with emotion. Yet that joy turned uneasy the moment he noticed the ticket was only one way. No return date, no mention of coming back, a ticket wrapped in love, or a trap disguised as kindness. When a parent's golden years are placed entirely in the hands of their children, does care always mean protection, or can it hide betrayal? What would you choose, trust or suspicion? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to hear the rest of this story. The neighborhood wore its order like a pressed shirt, lawns stretched evenly to the curb, edged with precision by men who measured their weekends in inches of grass. Mailboxes gleamed with fresh coats of paint. Porches carried rocking chairs that swayed slightly in the breeze as if waiting for occupants who knew the rhythm of patience. From the outside, it was the kind of suburb where stories ended happily, not where they unraveled. Inside one such house, the old man's morning began not with peace, but with the slow grind of habit. He brewed coffee that no longer tasted strong, poured it into the same chipped mug he had used for years, and sat in a chair that sagged in familiar ways. The house was tidy but tired. Curtains hung heavy with dust, photo frames leaned slightly, and the refrigerator hummed louder than it should. These were the small signals of age objects holding their ground long after their shine had faded. David, the elder son, visited often enough to keep appearances. He arrived with pressed shirts, polished shoes, and a voice that carried certainty. Neighbors nodded approvingly when they saw him step out of his car. To them, he was the model of devotion, the son who stayed involved. He asked questions about medications, about bills, about whether the old man needed repairs around the house. His presence had the quality of reassurance. Yet beneath the cadence of care there lingered an undertone, one that... Melissa completed this performance. She greeted warmly, bringing pastries from a local bakery, arranging them neatly on the table as though hospitality could be staged like theater. She listened intently, laughed at the right moments, and spoke gently of rest and recovery. Her words wrapped the old man in comfort, yet her eyes sometimes betrayed calculation, flicking toward the stack of mail on the counter, pausing on envelopes stamped with the red ink of unpaid balances. The old man wanted to believe in their concern. He wanted to see in them the fulfillment of all his sacrifices. And so he smiled, accepted the pastries, and nodded when David explained the wisdom of traveling south for a while. Florida, they said, would heal him. Sunshine would ease his joints, and proximity to good care would offer safety. It was framed as a gift, a reward after years of labor. To question it felt like ingratitude. Mark drifted in and out of these scenes like background noise. His visits were unannounced, his clothes plain, his hands rough from long hauls on the highway. When he spoke, his words lacked polish. His opinions carried little weight. The father often dismissed him with a sigh, too tired to interpret loyalty when it did not shine. Neighbors noticed too, whispering that David was the good son, the one who had made something of himself. Mark was the one who lingered in the shadows, reliable perhaps, but the house itself bore silent witness to the imbalance. On one wall hung framed diplomas and photographs of David's milestones, graduations, award ceremonies where applause filled the air. On another wall, almost bare, a single snapshot of Mark leaned crooked in its frame, taken years ago at a family barbecue. Smoke curled in the background, his shirt stained with grease, his smile hesitant. The contrast told the story without words. As weeks passed, David and Melissa increased their visits. They brought brochures of retirement communities in Florida, images of palm trees and smiling residents. They spoke of easy living, of the relief of no longer managing a house. They emphasized safety, companionship, and convenience. Each conversation wove the same narrative. This was not abandonment, but provision. The old man listened, torn between doubt and desire. He had grown weary of winters of shoveling snow from a driveway that seemed longer each year. The thought of warm breezes and gentle afternoons tempted him. Yet something in his chest resisted. His house, though weary, carried the echoes of his wife's laughter, the weight of his own labor. Leaving felt like surrender. Still, the persistence of David and Melissa pressed against him, softening his resistance day by day. The days leading up to the supposed trip carried the rhythm of ritual. David called his father each evening, his tone warm, his words steady. He spoke of weather in Florida, of the comfort of ocean breezes, of how the sun would soothe the aches that Midwestern winters carved into aging bones. His voice painted pictures of palm trees and sandy walks, images vivid enough to distract from the unease his father sometimes felt when silence stretched between details. Melissa filled the spaces in between. She arrived with lists, with reminders, with the gentle insistence of someone who seemed to know best. She packed a small bag for him, folding shirts, neatly slipping in slippers, tucking away the chipped mug he favored. She told him it would make Florida feel like home. Her care appeared seamless, but the old man noticed how her eyes lingered on the stack of bills, how she carried them discreetly into another room, how she whispered with David afterward. Mark stopped by one evening carrying groceries he had picked up on his way back from a delivery route. He placed them on the counter without ceremony, muttered something about keeping the fridge stocked, and left before David and Melissa arrived. The old man barely thanked him, distracted by the glossy brochures spread across the table. Later he wondered why he had not noticed the fatigue etched into Mark's shoulders, the quiet steadiness of his gestures. Neighbors watched from a distance. They saw David helping his father into the car for appointments, Melissa carrying bags of supplies. They nodded approvingly. Their judgments confirmed this was what good children looked like. When Mark passed by in his truck, they offered only polite waves, their eyes sliding past him as though he were incidental. The narrative had been written and they believed it without question. By the time the departure day arrived, the stage had been set. The old man had been told the story often enough to believe it. Florida was not exile, it was rest. His suitcase sat by the doorlight with clothes Melissa had chosen. David handled the travel details, speaking of convenience, assuring him everything was prepared. Melissa smiled warmly, her hand resting on his shoulder as though to steady him. The father stepped outside into the bright morning. The car waited at the curb trunk, open engine humming. Neighbors waved from their porches, their smiles carrying approval. To them it looked like devotion. To him it felt like inevitability. He lowered himself into the seat, the suitcase beside him, and the door closed with a sound that marked not the beginning of a vacation, but the first note of betrayal yet to be named. The old man's life had been a ledger of sacrifices. Born with little, he traded his body's strength for his family's survival. Long shifts beneath hoods of cars left his hands cracked, his back bent, his lungs filled with the dust of exhaust. Dreams of rest, of travel, even of sleep were postponed again and again. Paychecks slipped through his fingers like water, never kept, always redirected into shoes for his sons, food for the table, or bills that threatened to swallow the house whole. David, the eldest, was the crown jewel of those sacrifices. Teachers praised him, neighbors admired him, and the father glowed with pride each time his son's name was mentioned. David was the reason for the skipped meals, the unpaid doctor visits, the winter coats that never came. To the father, David embodied hope, proof that poverty could be exchanged for respect if only he carried the burden long enough. Mark the younger was the opposite in his eyes. Restless, unimpressed by classrooms, he seemed to resist every form of discipline. Where David came home polished and praised, Mark returned with excuses and scuffed shoes. The father, weary from his own labor, judged quickly. David is the future, he thought. Mark will only drag us back. That belief hardened over the years, turning sharp whenever Mark stumbled. Yet history had been quietly rewriting itself in the margins. Mark's gestures were rarely celebrated, rarely even noticed, but they accumulated like bricks in an unseen foundation. When property taxes threatened the house, an envelope of cash appeared without a signature. When the old man was too sick to shop, groceries materialized at the door in the night. When fever once shook his body, Mark abandoned a trucking route, losing pay, to drive him through darkness to the hospital. These sacrifices arrived in fragments, stitched into ordinary days. To the father, they seemed insignificant beside David's degrees and successes, but small things repeated became structure. Without fanfare, Mark had been carrying a weight his father never credited him for. The old man's wife had always believed the sacrifices would matter. He could still see her hands red from dishwater, hear her steady voice soothing his frustration when bills outweighed wages. She reminded him that their struggles would shape stronger futures for their sons. Her death had left a hollow place in the house, and into that emptiness the father poured all his hope into David. At her graveside, he had promised to keep the family together. In practice, that vow had become favoritism. David thrived under it. He studied, graduated, and presented himself as a man in control. His visits carried the polish of professionalism. He asked questions in a voice that inspired trust, stood tall in rooms where others slouched, and convinced his father that loyalty was as certain as success. To the father, David's shine became the proof he had lived rightly. Mark remained the afterthought. His truck driving job was steady but unremarkable. His boots carried the dust of highways, his clothes smelled of diesel, and his manners were too rough for the father's pride. Every stumble reinforced the judgment Mark would never rise, never lead, never shoulder responsibility. Though Mark continued to show up, the father's eyes refused to see him clearly. Memory sharpened now in hindsight like a knife turned inward. The old man recalled trudging home in the snow after another shift, believing his suffering justified by David's potential. He remembered scolding Mark for dropping out blind to the quiet loyalty that drove him to cover debts or appear when needed. Pride had narrowed his vision so tightly that he mistook polish for loyalty and silence for failure. The montage replayed Mark tinkering in a cold garage to fix an old television so his father could watch the game. Mark slipping vitamins into the grocery bag, muttering that they were extras. Mark parking his truck outside at midnight, checking in before leaving again. Each act was simple. Together they spoke louder than any degree or diploma. The father had missed it all, or rather he had seen it, but dismissed it, blinded by the brighter shine of David's path. That blindness calcified into belief. David was destiny. Mark was disappointment. It was easier to cling to that story than to question the foundation of decades. His wife might have corrected him had she lived longer. She saw Mark more clearly, praising his persistence, his quiet reliability. But her voice had been silenced, leaving David to occupy the throne of her absence. The old man had convinced himself that honoring her meant investing only in David, the child who looked most like success. And so the years rolled by, weighted by a skewed arithmetic. Pride multiplied, shame divided, and trust accrued in the wrong account. The father had never balanced the books correctly. Only now, staring at the mounting evidence of betrayal, did he realize the miscalculation. The sun he had lifted onto a pedestal had been chiseling at its base. The sun he had ignored had been holding him upright all along. His life's arithmetic had been wrong. The cost of that miscalculation was beginning to reveal itself not in numbers, but in signatures forged in suitcases packed with scraps and dignity nearly erased. This realization did not arrive as thunder. It settled like a weight across his chest. Sacrifice had shaped his life, but it had also blinded him. Blind faith in David had made him vulnerable. Quiet loyalty from Mark had gone unrecognized. Now the reckoning had come. Pride was cracking, and through the cracks seeped the truth. Trust placed in the wrong hands could undo a lifetime's worth of labor. The drive to Sunshine Care felt like a surrender, disguised as kindness. The car slid beneath the awning with a hush, and in that hush the father sensed what waited inside. Not a resort promised by brochures and reassurances, but a transition designed without his consent. The lobby greeted him with choreography rather than warmth. Pens clicked, printers hummed, sneakers squeaked across waxed floors. The air carried a polite tang of disinfectant blended with citrus, clean enough to suggest reassurance, but sharp enough to remind him of hospitals. Framed certificates lined the walls, speaking of compliance and standards. A corkboard displayed a month of cheerful activities. Squares filled neatly with promises of diversion, chair yoga on Tuesdays, bingo on Thursdays, painting classes on Fridays. Life itself seemed reduced to a calendar that left no room for spontaneity. A montage condensed what words might otherwise belabor. Staff in matching polos with clipped badges moved briskly through halls of identical doors, transforming residents into room numbers. A dining room set for 4 at each table waited for conversations that rarely traveled past weather reports. A nurse pushed a medication cart down a corridor, its rattle serving as the metronome of the day. Everywhere the father looked, he saw an institution designed not to harm, but to flatten an architecture of compliance wrapped in pastel paint. In a small office, a stack of forms waited with a pen balanced across the top like bait. The intake specialist moved with the rhythm of repetition, clipboard sliding forward, smile calibrated to lower defenses, boxes checked off one by one. Dietary preferences, mobility assistance, insurance coverage. Each answer the father gave felt less like information and more like a gate closing quietly behind him. His suitcase sat on a chair. He unzipped it, expecting at least a hint of leisure fabrics chosen for sunlight and air. Instead, he found permanence written in cloth. A few worn shirts folded without care, pants with hems frayed, socks bundled in mismatched pairs, a chipped mug retrieved from the back of a cabinet, no sandals, no swimwear, no sunscreen. It was not a traveler's bag, but a declaration this was where he was meant to stay. His chest tightened. He closed the case gently, as if truth could be hidden again once acknowledged. The door opened and a staff member entered with a folder thick enough to carry confidence. Signature blocks glowed across its pages like runway lights, his name already printed in neat machine ink. The pen waited, but not for him. He read the lines, language softened control with words like dignity and independence. Yet there in crisp strokes was his name written without him. The signature did not bear the tremor of aging hands that had spent years twisting wrenches. It was smooth, deliberate, performed by someone who believed certainty could be drawn rather than earned. He turned another page. The same confident signature appeared, consent forged into existence. A cold drumbeat filled his ears. The building carried on, doors opening and closing, staff voices pitched to calm, but the floor beneath him tilted. He set the pen down and recognized what had been done. Fraud was a word he had not wanted to use, but wrong was undeniable. While he wrestled with that recognition, another story unfolded beyond the office. Melissa played her part with practiced grace. She thanked nurses, warmly asked about recreation schedules, and smiled as if worry were her only burden. Yet her phone told the truth. She would not alerts from creditors' balances swelling, an email confirming a loss on an investment. David's salary had plateaued, his ventures had failed, and bills had piled high. Their polished exterior concealed panic. Melissa was not driven by malice alone. Pressure had twisted her judgment. The family's financial house leaned dangerously, and in the father's assets, she saw a lifeline. What she told herself was efficiency, signatures handled, early decisions made before crisis could worsen, was in truth desperation, cloaked in sweetness. David, too, had hesitated only in the way a man hesitates when technical correctness sedates moral discomfort. Authority could be implied, he told himself. Transition could be framed as best practice. What mattered was stability. And stability meant quieting debts. Success in public made it easier to ignore compromises in private. Upstairs, the father learned the contours of his assigned room walls, painted a color designed for calm, a window framing little more than a parking lot, a nightstand shallow enough to hold only fragments of a life. A schedule card on the desk stood like a signpost for days that would no longer belong to him. Downstairs, a voice at the reception desk spoke a sentence that burned hotter than insult. His status was announced: resident left without family pickup. The words were clinical, necessary for procedure, yet they branded him abandoned. Other residents glanced in sympathy, eyes soft with recognition. Shame arrived quietly, arranging itself in his chest without need for cruelty. He sat in that shame, replaying decades of labor that had turned grease into groceries, pain into tuition, hunger into dignity for others. He had believed sacrifice would one day be answered with loyalty. Instead, it had been translated into paperwork that erased his consent. The days moved with the rhythm of the institution. Air conditioning divided heat into manageable cool. Televisions recycled daytime shows as company. Slippers patrolled the corridors. He practiced the art of not being startled by what had already been planned for him. The routine was not neglect. It was erasure delivered politely. Meanwhile, Melissa continued her double performance. Gratitude for staff on the outside, silent panic in her phone's glow. Her kindness looked convincing so long as no one peered too closely. She was not the villain she feared being called. She was a steward of a drowning ledger, desperate enough to mistake exploitation for necessity. Back in the office, another form slid across the desk, a consent to medication management. He did not pick up the pen. His eyes locked on the signature line, body tensing with recognition of a trap. He breathed through the panic and realized if signatures could be forged, then silence could be mistaken for compliance. He did not weep. He did not rage. He sat steady, learning the strength of refusal. It was not dramatic, but it was survival. The day might have ended in resignation, but evening brought a change in weather. A figure entered the corridor carrying the fatigue of highways and the smell of diesel. Work boots softened by miles, shoulders set with resolve. Mark had arrived. His presence altered the air. Without raising his voice, he began asking for copies of forms, timestamps, and signatures. He read policies as if they were maps. He treated each document not as an intimidation, but as a problem to be solved. His patience was relentless, his politeness sharpened into pressure. The father watched, and memory rearranged itself. The montage of Mark's quiet sacrifices, envelopes of cash, groceries at midnight, a truck parked in storm, suddenly aligned into a single truth. Appearance had failed as evidence. Action corrected the record. The son he had dismissed had arrived not for recognition, but for defense. Melissa maintained her charm before staff, but her phone buzzed with creditors' voices. She silenced it and smiled again, the mask intact. Pressure does not ask permission. It reveals the fragility of kindness without margin. Night settled over Sunshine Care. The aquarium glowed faintly. The fountain whispered outside, and staff rotated with the efficiency of a practiced crew. In his chest, shame cooled into precision. This had not been a misunderstanding. It had been a design, polished, desperate, and nearly successful. Mark returned to him with a stack of copies, thin but heavy with meaning. Evidence does not shout, it waits. The father held the papers and felt resolve harden. Tomorrow would not belong to silence. Tomorrow he would speak. Night pressed against the windows of Sunshine Care with the weight of permanence. The building, stripped of daytime chatter, hummed with a quieter pulse. Ventilation systems, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the distant clink of dishes stacked after dinner. For most residents, this rhythm was a lullaby. For him, it was an alarm that would not stop ringing. Sleep eluded him. Reflection. Anna's voice drifted in my memory. Promise me, don't let them erase your dignity. Anna's voice echoed faintly in my mind. Don't let them erase you, demanded its hour. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing hairline cracks that looked like veins of an unfinished map. Each crack pulled him backward into memory. He followed them like roads, and they led to sacrifice. Not abstract sacrifice, but hours bent over engines until his hands grew raw. Meals skipped so his children could eat. Jackets patched one more time so David might have a new one. All of it endured with the belief that suffering could be transformed into respect through the bright promise. David had been that promise. Teachers praised him, neighbors admired him, and the father glowed with pride. Sacrifice felt meaningful when it could be tallied against David's achievements. Tuition paid applause, earned a path carved upward. Every hardship was justified by the image of David standing taller than he ever could. Mark was another story. Mark was the weight at the bottom of the ledger, the one he believed would never rise. Restless, unimpressed by school, uninterested in polish, Mark returned home with grease on his clothes, excuses in his voice, and a defiance that grated on his tired ears. The father judged swiftly. He poured trust into David and withheld it from Mark, assuming one was destined for leadership and the other for disappointment. But the ledger, reviewed in hindsight, told another story. The cracks in the ceiling led him to different scenes. Small, persistent gestures Mark had carried out quietly without applause. A bag of groceries left when cupboards ran bare. An envelope of cash slipped under a stack of mail when property taxes threatened the house. A truck idling in the driveway at midnight waiting to drive him to the hospital when fever bent him low. They were not milestones, not celebrated achievements, but they were proof. Polish versus presence. The words circled in his mind. David had polish. Melissa had polish, too refined into charm. They knew how to perform loyalty, how to appear as caretakers. Presence was quieter. It was grease on hands, fatigue in eyes, a voice that showed up when no one else did. Presence did not earn applause from neighbors or nods of approval from church pews, but presence held the line when polish disappeared. Shame pressed heavier than the blanket on his chest. He remembered the day of his wife's funeral, when Mark had stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, his tie crooked, his shoes dusty. The father had barely looked at him, instead leaning into David's polished embrace. He had mistaken appearance for devotion. Mark's silence had been misread as indifference. Only now, replaying the memory, did he see the truth. Mark had been the one who drove him home that night, who made sure he ate, who stayed until... More memories surfaced. Thanksgiving dinners when David arrived late but with stories that dazzled the table. Mark showed up early, carving the turkey, ensuring everyone had a plate. Christmas mornings when David's polished gifts gleamed under the tree. Mark's were smaller, practical, a new tool, a warm jacket, but bought with hours of labor no one acknowledged. He had misjudged their value then. In the quiet of Sunshine Care, their value roared back with clarity. And always his wife. Her memory threaded through the night like a soft refrain. He remembered her hands red from dishwater, her voice steady as she told him their struggles would shape stronger futures. He remembered promising at her grave that he would keep the family together. He thought he had honored that promise by lifting David, by betting on polish. But now he saw he had misunderstood. Keeping the family together did not mean rewarding betrayal. It meant protecting love where it remained, even if... The shame of favoritism burned. He saw himself scolding Mark for dropping out of school, words sharp enough to scar. He saw himself dismissing Mark's gifts as afterthoughts, never pausing to wonder what sacrifices lay behind them. He had been blind, and blindness had nearly cost him not just dignity but autonomy. The forged signature was not just a betrayal by David and Melissa. It was the harvest of his own misjudgments. He had given them the tools to betray by granting them his trust without question. Yet shame was not the only companion. Clarity had joined it. Clarity that polish could be forged, performed, and faked. Presence could not. Clarity that sacrifice meant little if invested in the wrong vessel. Clarity that love misdirected could become the seed of ruin. Resolve followed clarity, slow but steady. He would not be silent anymore. Silence had been mistaken for consent, and consent had been forged into existence without him. He would correct it. With Mark at his side and the law as his tool, he would redraw the lines. His legacy would not be left vulnerable to desperation disguised as devotion. He thought of his granddaughter, her patient guidance as she showed him how to swipe across a phone screen. Her laughter, brightening rooms heavier than grief. She represented trust untainted by performance, loyalty unshaped by desperation. To her he could give what he had once given David: resources, opportunity, protection. Only this time, it would not be squandered. The suitcase by the wall whispered its insult. A chipped mug, frayed shirts, mismatched socks. Once they had humiliated him. Now they looked like exhibits, proof of intent, evidence that betrayal had been planned, not imagined. He would not let them define him. Instead, he would let them indict those who packed them. The hours stretched deep into the night. He rose once, pacing the room, his reflection in the dark window staring back at him. He barely recognized the man he saw, older, yes, but also sharper, less willing to be dismissed. Dignity once misplaced in blind faith now returned in the form of refusal. He rehearsed tomorrow in his mind, questions asked, documents demanded, signatures withheld until earned, not rebellion, but reclamation. When he finally lay back down, the cracks in the ceiling no longer looked like veins of an unfinished map. They looked like rivers converging toward a single point. Tomorrow would be that point. The day he would no longer measure his life in sacrifices unacknowledged, but in boundaries reclaimed. The building exhaled around him, nightlights glowing at the baseboards like faint stars. Shame had shaken him awake. Clarity had shown him the path. Resolve would carry him forward. And for the first time in weeks, his eyes closed, not in despair, but in preparation. Sleep came slowly, but it came. And in its arrival, he felt rest not as surrender, but as readiness. The morning after felt heavier than the night. Sunshine care stirred awake with the mechanical rhythm of breakfast trays and the shuffling of residents toward the dining hall. But for the old man, the day was no longer scripted by the calendar on the wall. Today was about reclaiming authorship. Mark didn't stop with one visit to the care home. He went to the bank asking questions with his quiet persistence. A clerk hesitated, then revealed withdrawals Melissa had made using a power of attorney document. But the signature was the same shaky forgery they had tried to pass at the insurance office. Mark photographed everything. "This isn't just betrayal," he told me later. "It's theft." Mark arrived early, carrying folders he had gathered the night before, photocopies, facility handbooks, a notebook of his own observations. He had spent hours reading the fine print under a desk lamp while the old man drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Beside him now, the papers felt less like documents and more like tools. They sat together in the small room that had hosted the intake interview. This time the air was different. A speakerphone sat in the center of the desk, its red light blinking alive. On the other end of the line, an elder law attorney introduced himself with the calm cadence of someone who had walked this road many times before. His voice carried authority without sharpness, each word a steady step on ground the old man thought he had lost. The lawyer explained what had happened in terms the father could hold on to. Contracts required intent. Intent required knowledge and agreement. A forged signature voided the entire document no matter how carefully it was presented. Consent was not a box to be checked retroactively. It was the active will of the person affected written in their own hand. Without it, the forms Melissa had submitted were paper, only paper that could collapse under scrutiny. Mark listened intently, taking notes, his pen scratching across the page like a declaration. The old man sat straighter with each sentence, shame slowly giving way to clarity. He realized the suitcase of worn clothes, the signature forged with precision, the humiliation of being logged as abandoned. These were not accidents. They were evidence, and evidence had power. The lawyer outlined the next steps: a written notice of revocation, a demand for records, and if necessary a petition in probate court to invalidate any misuse of his name. The process sounded daunting, but the man who had once lifted engines from their mounts understood tools when he saw them. These were legal tools, and with Mark and the attorney guiding him, he could wield them. When David entered the room with Melissa trailing just behind, the atmosphere tightened. David carried his usual polish, a confident stride, and a voice already prepared to sound reasonable. Melissa wore the same gentle smile she had practiced for staff, but her eyes flickered when they landed on the stack of papers spread across the desk. The lawyer spoke clearly through the speakerphone, summarizing the situation for all present: forged signatures, improper intake procedures, a resident who had not consented. Each phrase struck like a hammer against the facade David and Melissa had built. David attempted to redirect, speaking about concern for his father's well-being, about how transitions were never easy, about how misunderstanding could look like misconduct. His tone was smooth, but his words wavered at the edges. Melissa remained silent, at first her fingers tight around the strap of her handbag. Then the lawyer asked a direct question: who had placed the signature on the form? Silence stretched across the room. David cleared his throat but said nothing. Melissa's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the mask slipped. She spoke of urgency, of financial strain, of the belief that action taken quickly was better than waiting until crisis forced their hand. It was then the truth spilled out, not as confession, but as justification. Bills had piled up, creditors called daily. An investment that promised returns had failed spectacularly. They had seen the father's assets not only as inheritance, but as salvation. Signing early, they believed, was a way of protecting everyone from collapse. The old man listened, his chest tight, but not from weakness. For the first time, he saw clearly the machine that had driven their choices. This was not love misapplied. It was desperation weaponized, and it had nearly stolen his freedom. The lawyer's tone remained steady. Pressure, he explained, never justified forgery. Financial distress did not excuse stripping someone of autonomy. The law protected the elderly from exactly these maneuvers. If pressed, the matter could be escalated, and the consequences for those who had attempted fraud would not be light. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. David's posture stiffened, his polish cracking. They both recognized that the ground beneath them was giving way. The father, however, felt the ground beneath him firming. He signed the revocation papers with deliberate strokes, each letter drawn with the weight of decades spent undervalued. He signed not just for legality, but for dignity. Mark witnessed his signature steady beside his father's. The lawyer confirmed that the action effectively nullified the forged documents. For the first time in weeks, the father breathed deeply. The room didn't change, but its air felt freer. The confrontation was not explosive. No shouting, no slammed doors. It was sharper than that, a dismantling of illusion. David's arguments dissolved into vagueness. Melissa's defenses collapsed under their own contradictions. They left the room quieter than they had entered, the performance of control stripped away. Later, back at the house, the father lowered himself into his old recliner. The walls seemed to embrace him. The neighbor waved from across the driveway. The ordinary details, the creak of the floorboards, the smell of coffee grounds left in the tin. The picture of his wife on the mantel became proof that life was still his to own. Mark sat across from him, not asking for thanks, not demanding recognition, just present, steady the way he had always been. The father studied him now with new eyes. Mark was not the failure he had once judged. He was the witness, the protector, the son who had never needed polish to prove his worth. That night in the care facility, staring at the ceiling, I remembered Anna, my late wife. On the night before her surgery years ago, she gripped my hand and whispered, "Promise me, no matter what, our boys will never abandon you." The memory sliced through me. It wasn't just betrayal of blood I felt. It was the breaking of a vow I had carried like scripture. That night, the father pulled out a folder he had ignored too long, his estate documents. He spread them across the table, reading with a patience he had never before applied. Each line mattered now. Legacy was no longer an abstract idea or a word repeated in sermons. Legacy was action. Legacy was deciding who would be trusted, who would be shielded, and who would be kept at a distance. The decision formed as steadily as ink drying on paper. David and Melissa could no longer be the inheritors of his life's work. Their betrayal had revealed itself too clearly. The granddaughter, however, had offered him something no document could replicate: trust untainted by performance. Her laughter, her patient guidance with a smartphone, her loyalty unstained by ambition. She represented the future he had once dreamed for his family before pride and blindness led him astray. He would change his will, not tomorrow, tonight if possible. He would place the weight of his estate not in the hands of those who saw it as escape from debt, but into the care of the child who saw him as more than a ledger of assets. As he drafted notes, resolve hardened. This was not vengeance. It was correction. A lifetime of sacrifices deserved to be honored by someone who understood their meaning. The father closed the folder and looked once more at the photograph of his wife. He spoke to her in silence, telling her that the promise at her grave was not broken. It had simply been misunderstood. Keeping the family whole did not mean rewarding betrayal. It meant protecting love where it still lived. The night grew quiet. Paper rested on the table pen beside it. Tomorrow the lawyer would formalize the changes, but tonight dignity returned in the shape of preparation. For the first time in a long while, he felt not like a man waiting for decisions, but like a man making them. The living room table became the stage for the final act. Papers lay spread in careful rows, each one carrying the weight of decades. The elder law attorney had arrived in person this time, his briefcase resting by the chair, his presence calm but firm. The old man sat at the head of the table, Mark to his left, and across from them, the granddaughter eyes wide, hands folded tightly in her lap. The lawyer explained every clause with patient precision. No signature would appear without full understanding. The father nodded at each section, his gaze steady as pen poised. When he placed his mark on the first page of the new will, the stroke was deliberate, heavy with the gravity of correction. This was not a gift born of sentimentality. It was an act of justice. The granddaughter blinked back tears as her name appeared on the page. She had not asked for this, had never expected it, but in her grandfather's eyes, she saw the trust that had been withheld from others. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. For the first time, he felt that his sacrifices had found their true heir. David and Melissa entered halfway through the process. They had been invited not for approval, but for transparency. Their arrival chilled the air. David's face carried the same polish, but his eyes darted toward the documents with recognition of what they meant. Melissa's smile flickered thin and brittle as she sat without being asked. The lawyer continued unfazed. He read aloud the section disinheriting David and Melissa, citing the reasons: clearly breach of trust, attempted exploitation, evidence of forged documents. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, rippling through the room. David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Melissa shifted in her seat, fingers clenching her handbag as though it might anchor her. The granddaughter glanced at them briefly, then turned back to her grandfather, her expression one of quiet defiance. Page after page the father signed. Each stroke felt like reclaiming ground that had once slipped away. When the final page lay before him, he paused. He looked at Mark, then at his granddaughter, then finally at the lawyer. With a steady hand, he placed his signature at the bottom. The will was complete. Relief washed over him, but it was not the relief of victory, it was the relief of alignment. The knowledge that the truth of his life now lived in ink as well as memory. David broke the silence at last, his voice low but sharp. He asked what kind of father would humiliate his own son in writing. The old man did not respond. He simply closed the folder and slid it back to the lawyer. Words were unnecessary. The signatures spoke louder than argument. Melissa rose quickly, muttering something about needing air, and stepped into the hallway. For a moment, no one followed. The granddaughter leaned against her grandfather's shoulder, whispering that he had done the right thing. Mark rested a hand on the table, silent but solid. Then the phone rang. David glanced at the screen, his expression shifting. He answered, turning slightly away from the room. The fragments of the conversation were enough. An attorney, a mention of appeal, a promise that this isn't over. His polished tone cracked with urgency. Melissa returned moments later, her handbag heavier than before. No one noticed her slip a folder into its depths, a thin packet of photocopied papers she had taken earlier from the nursing home's file. She smiled faintly as she rejoined David, the mask restored. The old man did not see the stolen papers, nor did he hear the full weight of David's conversation. But he felt the shift in the air, the certainty that storms never end cleanly. Victories must always be defended. The lawyer packed his briefcase. The granddaughter helped her grandfather back into his chair by the window. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the neighborhood in gold. The house felt warmer, steadier, as though it too approved of what had been written within its walls. The old man looked at the photograph of his late wife on the mantel. He told her silently that the promise was kept not perfectly, but truthfully. The family would endure, reshaped by loyalty rather than pretense. And yet beneath the peace of the evening, new currents stirred. Appeal, photocopies, desperation disguised as determination. The battle was not finished. It had only changed arenas. The story paused there, balanced between resolution and threat, dignity, and defiance. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen loyalty overlooked and betrayal rewarded? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of these family dramas. And as always, take care of yourself too. Drink water. Stay healthy and treasure the people who stand by you in difficult times. If you were in my shoes, would you forgive family who betrayed you or cut them off forever? Share your thoughts. I truly want to know. Thank you for watching.